to be so American that that's what immigrants did, people with accents. And, you know, she was born in Boston, well, New York actually, but she was raised in Boston, and she couldn't free herself from saying that she's gone further than her parents, and we were going backwards. Could I see that then at the age of 19? It's taken until the age of 70. But so there's time, right? Family time goes slowly. But so you say to yourself, well, if you could appreciate more the struggle that your mother is having and listen to this, what does it mean to her to say, Gewalt, my daughter's becoming frum? What's the Gewalt? The Gewalt is the mother's eye position. Now, if we want to raise the differentiation in the family, we don't want the daughter to say, well, God doesn't favor her, right? We would rather have her say, she has a struggle that this is not the time for her. We are not synchronized. My time is going differently than her time. And so we live with the difficulty, but we're not going to lower the differentiation and either say, oh, never mind, Shabbos isn't that important, or look, I can't live with this family. So what do? You live in attention and give other people time, right? And a lot of times when you say to yourself, it's not the right time for her, we're not synchronized, that allows for the other time to take place. So that's a very important point. That's why I'm glad that you brought it up, both for those of us who have been through these things and for people who are dealing with clients. Not everybody's at the same time all the time. But if you say to yourself, well, the fact that you're moving in a certain direction, is there something about the family time that has meaning that this is happening to you now? What time is it in your family? Right? Yeah, you just
yeah, so if they're not in sync.
What's that? They're not in sync.
Well, if they're not in sync in that moment, but they're both speaking from like an I position, does that mean it's still just objective? It's just not co-creation?
So Yudis is asking it's not an obvious question, it's a deep question. So what's co-creation here, right? And, you know, co-creation is in some ways a kind of a fantasy. It's kind of a vector, like you would like to get to that moment when you can say to your mother, for example, you and I are so different, and we're mother and daughter, right? That's co-creation. Now, does that solve everything? No, because she's who she is, and the girl is who she is, and the girl can say to her mother, I'm not here to change you. I'm here to try to talk to you. And so we can understand each other and that we're different. And then, has that happened before in our relationship? No. So if it hasn't happened before in our relationship, that's co-creation. Co-creation isn't an absolute. It's part of a spiral. In other words, we're able to have this conversation, and next Pesach, when we're talking about how to clean the house, it'll be a little bit different. Co-creation is in small steps. Co-creation isn't that suddenly mother and daughter hug each other and say, yes, I understand you, and yes, I understand you, and so everything is fine. That's a fantasy. But small creations, one of the problems in therapy is that therapists sometimes look too far ahead. In other words, they look with a telescope instead of with a microscope. Therapy looks with a microscope. It makes you very modest because things are small. But you say, well, you know, let's just, you know, you had this conversation on the telephone with your mother. Is there something that you said to her that you haven't said before? Is there something that she heard she hasn't heard before? Is there something you heard that you haven't heard before? Well, if it's just one thing, but, oh, wait a minute. One thing is one thing. That's where co-creation is, in those small little pieces where people find each other. It's not a done deal. Co-creation is never a done deal, because as we're talking, mother and daughter are also both changing. Time is going on. So it's never a done deal. But is there something that moved ahead in the relationship? That's co-creation. And that's what makes people feel a connection that's alive. Connections that are alive, things that are alive are always in movement. Yeah?
So co-creation is very, very nice. But the question is, because I'm asking because...
Wait, just a second. Everybody has this question, right? Every time that we talk about co-creation, in everybody's kishka, there's this, co-creation is all very good and fine, but, okay.
We were dealing, I'm saying we because Lindsay and me were dealing with a family together this week. He's treating, can I bring the case here? Because I think it's very appropriate to the subject.
Yeah.
so he's treating the son and I'm treating the mother, and we had a family session together this week. And there's actually the other, what you just described, we have the opposite. The daughter is not religious, she's 14 only, and the mother is very religious, and she can't even eat in her own home because her kids are mixing up basare and halabi, and it's so that's for her a very difficult situation.
Right.
Now, where does it come in that she's the head of the household, and even like the rules, she has to set the rules, and the kids have to listen, and then there has to, but on the other hand, yeah, we were trying to do co-creation. On the other hand, there's like, it's very, she is the mom, like.
See, when you set yourself to the family clock, let's take this family that you're talking about, and you say, okay, so what time is it by you? You say to yourself, okay, let's do intersubjectivity. You've raised enough trouble that people need to buzz a little bit and then we'll get back together. When you guys are finished buzzing, we'll get back together. It's a compliment to Racey's question, right? Because it creates buzzes. You can't continue until you've said something. Okay, so when everybody said what they had to say, I'm going to go on. This happens in families too. You want it to go a certain way, but it goes a little differently. So you say to yourself, okay, you guys into subjectivity, and the family says, no. We don't know how to do intersubjectivity right now. Things are so bad that we need to put our feet together in something that's regulated, right? That's the whole point of this. Now,
instead of being intersubjective, we need to work on regulation.
Right. See, in other words, a psychoanalyst would say, this is resistance. But then, a psychoanalyst said...
What is resistance?
Well, a psychoanalyst would say, this is resistance, and resistance...
It's something in the computer.
Resistance is a sign of anxiety, and anxiety is a sign of things not being regulated. And of course you're resisting. That's the part of the deal, right? Freud discovered that from the very beginning, that he's, gives all these Bürgermeisters about insights into whatever, and somebody says, I don't know, I've stopped dreaming. And so when you stop dreaming, you have to put it in the context. The person's coming at 10 o'clock every day, 6 days a week. You stop dreaming because you're anxious. And of course you're anxious, because we're talking about change. And so anxiety is not the enemy, it's something to be understood. What are you anxious about, right? So when the family says we can't do intersubjectivity, you say that's no surprise. Intersubjectivity is the special moments that happen when people feel safe enough. Right now, this family does not feel safe enough to try to do anything except get back to safety. And so with that family, although these are techniques that you haven't learned yet, and we'll get to them, you might say, look, right now we need to find something that makes everybody feel safe. Now, we're not positing something here, but if it weren't from the Torah, you would say, so how about if the family is kosher on Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and they mix up the dishes on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, right? For example, when there's law and order, and there's also chaos, you say to the family, well, the family is working on what to do with law and order and chaos, so let's do half and half for now. That's a technique that we'll get to. It's a regulation technique. You see, what you're raising is a question, the but. Oh, it's all fine and dandy, but our clients are oftentimes involved in things that are not regulated enough. So the family time is over here, and we want to do paka with all sorts of techniques. And one of the tragedies of all psychotherapy teaching is that we all learn the intersubjective techniques, which are correct and useful for ourselves and for 20% of our clients, right? And then we say, well, that's psychotherapy, so these people can't do it, so out the door. Or there's lots of ways to have them find the door. Instead of learning how to deal with the tools that are helpful for regulation before you get into subjectivity. But we're not there yet. The question is there. The answers will be coming now and in the third year when you're ready for it. We're not in sync, right? Yeah.
Just but where does intersubjectivity come in? If there is a young girl, she's 14, she doesn't yet know what she wants in life. She wants to choose any school that's of her liking, and she wants to be transgender or whatever. But her mother wants her to stay from. So where does, like I'm saying, she still needs guidance. You can't, like on the other hand, you want to create, like, give her to a feeling of like she's too young for that.
Right, so it would, you all follow the question? What do you do with a 14-year-old who needs guidance? There's something in this mother's guidance which is not secure. If it were secure for mother and daughter, the guidance would be working. It's not working not because the little girl has just suddenly gone off the Bronco. The girl has grown up in this family, and something has not been negotiated developmentally that allows her to feel safe that when her mother says this is good for you, that her mother is seeing her and not just herself in the mirror. Right? So then we need to understand what went on with the mother when she was 14 and how she developed her discussions and what she could say or not say to her mother when she was 14 and what she was left not able to say. Because a lot of times an adolescent will say to their parent precisely what the parent was not able to say to their parent. You hear it all the time in families. The family says, if I would have said that to my father, so that's a compliment, you know. In other words, so I couldn't say it to my father, so that's why I have a son. So now he's saying it to me. But you need to put it in the framework of time. And a lot of times you need to regulate it first before you can move it ahead. But you see, you're introducing, and we'll all do this, so it's a useful question. We're introducing external parameters. In other words, say, well, the girl needs guidance. Let's think families about what is guidance. Guidance is something that holds over here. Guidance goes on in conversation between people. Guidance works when the relationship works. Guidance doesn't work when something's problematic in the relationship, which right now is dysregulated, and we need to get it back. But you can't just say 14-year-olds need guidance, because the 14-year-old doesn't need guidance. The 14-year-old needs a mother who believes in her own guidance, right? And the mother apparently doesn't quite enough believe in it.
What do you mean she's a mother?
But a 14-year-old needs a mother who she's sure is seeing her. That's the I position. If the mother is saying, look, I need a daughter to be firm, and this is going to be part of the tragedy of some families in the firm community, that the mother is saying to herself, the truth is I don't even have a voice here because the neighbors of this shotgun, right? So there are things that make the intersubjectivity, there are social things that limit intersubjectivity, and a social view would say we need to give families room to breathe, or the daughter ends up paying the price for the fact that the mother can't breathe. That's a big one that we'll discuss over time, and that you'll discover what to do with it. I don't know what to do with it. But if the mother has no way to say anything, except it has to be this way, doesn't matter who you are, it has to be this way, and I'm calling it guidance, the girl says, that's not the guidance I need, right? So that's a family that is out of regulation, and we have to learn how to help them to get back to regulation. They're not at the point of having the freedom into subjectivity. Intersubjectivity is a great bracha, right? A bracha means something that expands, it gets further, you know, you bend your knee, and it's different than when it's straight. So at least that's what Chaim Volozhin thought. So it's a bracha. We're not always, therapy doesn't always start at the point of a bracha. Sometimes it starts at something very narrow. And we have to figure out where to develop enough room to breathe in order to, okay, so you know, when you say intersubjectivity is fine, but 80% of your clients are going to say that to you. They'll say, baka, 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 we need to feel safe, right? And then we'll have to learn how to do that. That's, it's more advanced techniques. Why? Because it makes the family different from us, right? We like doing things, like the mother likes doing things that are good for her. Therapists like doing things that are good for us. We like intersubjectivity. A lot of our clients are not ready for it. That's one of the challenges of family therapy, which hopefully we'll learn over time, and that by the time you finish, you'll feel secure enough to say, I'm not being a bad therapist by dealing with regulation, right? Yeah.
Just going back to the Bryce family, so that was the same situation. Claudia was all over the place, and Caroline was reacting to seeing her teenage daughter, reminding her of how she was as a teenager.
Right.
the rest of it.
Right.
But in order to get back to regulation, I'm trying to remember exactly what took place. And I remember it was something to do with Claudia coming to help her mother clear the table, the dishes. There was something, does anyone else remember?
People remember we're deep into the price fair?
No, because it was like incremental step. It was something very small, but it brought about some kind of regulation, and from there they were able to develop a relationship.
A good example of how to read the family crucible. If you haven't read it that way, read it again, right? Because the reason I want you to read the family crucible is not a single word in this course that overlaps the family crucible. It's a different discourse. And that allows you to play with two discourses. That makes you smart. So, yeah, so that's, if you look at it from the point of view of regulation and subjective, you'll see the kinds of things that Whitaker and Napier do are not formulated that way, but that's the way you could formulate it. And you could say, Carolyn, what has to happen is that Claudia and Carolyn have a small space in a microscopic setting where they can set the dishes together and feel like mother and daughter again, right? And then they can talk. In the meantime, we're helping Carolyn to see that she's not necessarily seeing Claudia, she's seeing herself. And the main thing that you can see in the family crucible is that Claudia is caught in a triangle because David and Caroline haven't figured things out, right? And so Claudia is the regulator of what can take place between, that's when the lecture about conflict was about that. That, until you get to David and Caroline settling their matters, but you can't start with it. If the Bryce family had started with, let's do parental blah, 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 let's have David and Caroline talk with each other, never mind what's going on in Claudia, what would have gone on? They would have had a conversation and done marvelous, because Whitaker's the best as an intersubjective therapist. David and Caroline would have done blah, blah, blah in a session. The therapist would be writing it up and be happy, or making a tape. They would go home and find Claudia coming home at 3 o'clock naked again. And what are we going to do? And the blah, blah, blah isn't yet, it's not connected. So the way the family crucible works is that you disconnect the triangles first and you make room for dyads. And then you have room for the dyad of the father and mother. If you don't disconnect the triangles, you're not going to be able to work with the couple. That's an important caveat, because these days people don't see children at all. These days family therapists just take in couples because they like seeing adults. And they don't like seeing adolescents, and they certainly don't want to see kids like Laura, or let alone Dawn, that you're going to have to wrestle with him on the floor. Give me a break. So it's easier to talk about it with a couple, and 10%, maybe 15% of couples, the light will go on. Those are the very highly differentiated intersubjective families. The light will go on. The couple will say, yes, we now understand what's going on with our child. And you will say, that's therapy for everybody, which will be a huge mistake. That's therapy for some people, not for everybody. For a lot of people, they'll go home, the kid will be doing the same problem, and they'll end up doing the same triangle over again. And you'll say, well, they're not really treatable. Instead of saying this isn't the right treatment for them. So that's an important aspect of setting the clock to what the family is able to do and what they need. So let's go on a bit and take an example. This is, what you know, that intersubjectivity and higher differentiation go together, and lower differentiation doesn't mean the family's doing nothing. It means the family's busy regulating. And if that's what they're doing, we need to get enough regulation to be able to move ahead with intersubjectivity. This is the lecture that all of you are now able to give. Correct? Right? You can tell it to your friends. It becomes easier. So now we have a war, right? And missiles are falling on the area around Gaza, and bombs are falling inside of Gaza. And so we have what's called trauma. And children are rushing to bomb shelters. In Gaza, there are no bomb shelters, so they're just hoping that Allah will spare them. And we have a situation of trauma. What does trauma do to differentiation? Right? Trauma, it could be, the birth of a child with special, let's say even just a preemie who needs their parents to be away from the other kids for a couple of months, right? But, you know, when you deal with something like trauma, what happens? You go towards regulation. Every family, in every situation, when you're dealing with the kind of stress that is hard to make into differentiation for 95% of people, then you go to regulate, right? And if you think about what happens with trauma, the differentiation will go down, hopefully temporarily, right? If the therapist doesn't get the fact that something has lowered the differentiation, they might think, oh, these people are nuts, they've always been low differentiation. But if you say, what were you like before this happened? What could you talk about before it happened that you don't talk about now? You find out that there's an incident that lowers differentiation because it makes people busy regulating. When people are regulating, they don't necessarily go back to the level of intersubjectivity that they were at before. Does that make sense to you? Hopefully you'll have a chance to figure it out in your own families as well. Differentiation goes up and down. It's one of the things that Bowen did not recognize. Bowen looked at differentiation only from the point of view of families of origin. He didn't have a timeline, including for himself. That's why we did the timeline of Bowen's family, if you recall, last semester.
Is that because regulation doesn't really get rid of the stress?
Yes. Yes, regulation, if you pull Moshe by the tongue and say, actually what you're saying is that regulation keeps the stress there, right? In other words, doesn't allow you to get rid of the stress. It puts the stress into the family system. It concretizes it and keeps it there. It's not only doesn't get rid of it, it holds the stress and makes the family, it's like the bombs are still falling. In other words, the family organizes itself for the next missile. And there's no next missile, but the family's still organized in that way. So that regulation becomes a solution and a problem. Symptoms are always a solution. It's a pseudo-solution. It's a regulatory solution. And it's a problem because it's too good. In other words, you stay regulated, but you can't grow from it. Exactly. Yeah. But you haven't heard me?
I take my hand off.
Well, she's going to say what you were going to say. That's interesting.
When you're saying differentiation goes up and down,
A little louder,
when
yeah.
you're saying differentiation goes up and down, you're not just referring to post-trauma. You're saying in general, in every family, they have times when it goes
Correct.
up and down.
Regulation, as you saw when we talked about adolescence, when there's something new that the family has to work on, you can't work on something new without co-creation. So every adolescent needs a different kind of co-creation because they're different than they were before. And the family, therefore, is a family of an adolescent. It's an adolescent family. And the family is asked to do something different or to regulate because they can't quite do something different. For example, that's the story that Maria brought us is a situation where there's an adolescent. She wants to do something different. The family isn't ready to do something different, so there's a struggle, which is not a struggle about understanding each other. Intersubjectivity is never a struggle. Struggles are regulation. It's my way or it's your way. It has to be this way, it has to be that way. So the family is trying to regulate itself down because they're not quite able yet to go to something intersubjective. So, if we say, all right, well, missiles are falling. Now here in the Middle East, it's important to understand that there's trauma on both sides, because there are human beings on both sides. And it's useless to think about what they're doing to us without the fact that, you know, we're a little bit more powerful and doing more to them. That's how we win. But what do we win? Regulation. Not this intersubjective part is, you know, for the Mashiach. So if we say from us, so everything I'm saying about the Israeli family next to Gaza is true of the Palestinian family 2 kilometers away in Sajajia, Sajajia.
Why is that? Don't Israelis give warning and...
The issue is, what do you experience when there's war? No, there's no way to provide that kind of a clean war. nobody fights a cleaner war than Israel, but there's no such thing as a clean war. And as a result, if there are casualties, it wasn't as clean as we were trying to be. The other side is not trying to be clean, but that's not the issue. The issue is how human beings experience what their leaders can't figure out, right? And human beings on both sides experience fear, experience lack of control, and experience trauma. We're not talking about the Palestinian side because none of us know about it, right? We're not there. And unfortunately, we're not able to talk to them about it these days. So we have to imagine. So we'll stay with our side, but it doesn't mean there's only one side. That would be, I think, the Torah would see that as a mistake. Because not seeing other human beings is always a mistake, even if they're your enemy. But in this case, we're looking at our side. So what does the trauma do to differentiation? Well, what does it do to the I position? As soon as there's trauma, you always talk about them. You say, they're doing this, they're doing that. We're not talking about how I experience trauma, we're talking about those guys. We talk about those guys, they talk about those guys. Immediately, human beings are separated into different camps. I know you have a question.
Following up, a little distraction on what he said. I was curious, to me it sounds like a very, the whole idea of family therapy sounds like a very Western idea, but maybe in cultures where there's a very strong, I'm sure that all this is differentiation, opposition triangles, of course they all exist. But the question is, maybe they're not in focus. Meaning if the father has a very strong paternal, he's the leader of the house, in places where the women are really, not nehshav. It's my home, the kids are, you ignore the kids, your wife is subjective to you, and you feel almost like irrelevant. I feel like irrelevant.
So there's this fantasy. There's a fantasy that there is this situation where things are 100% clear. In other words, that because the father has a cultural position, he forces it on everybody else, and everybody accepts it, and life is simpler or perhaps better. It's a fantasy.
I wasn't saying that.
Right. It never has existed. There are times where, at times of fear, let's say trauma. So the father says, I'm going to protect you. Well, missiles and bombs are falling. Somebody has to protect me. So the father's position is, I'm going to protect you, even though it's fake, because he can't protect you. Everybody agrees to it, right? So then the father is going to get stuck in a position of, I'm going to protect you, and then I can't listen to you, because if I listen to you, you'll experience me as weak. And you can't afford to experience me as weak, because the whole world is falling apart, and you need to experience me as small. Those fathers have a great deal of difficulty freeing themselves from a position they're stuck in and listening to other people, because they're sure that everybody else needs them to be strong. You will meet fathers like that now. You have to, fantasize some non-Western world or something like that. You'll meet fathers like that all the time. They'll say, if I listen, who's going to be strong here? And then the people around him say, we don't need that anymore. That's like 2 generations ago we needed it because there were pogroms. Now there's only missiles. We don't need that. And so you are free, for example, to say, sometimes I feel afraid. Now, is there any human being who never feels afraid? If you ask people who are the great heroes of any, armed conflict, do you experience fear? The answer is always, if I didn't experience fear, I couldn't deal with anything, right? In other words, I have to have the fear and know what to do with it, right? It's not having fear. So the father who says, I can never feel weak, that's a problem with the I position, because every human being sometimes feels weak. For example, when a kid comes home from yeshiva and says, I don't like the Rebbe and I don't think he likes me. That's not a war, but one way to do it is to say, the Rebbe's always right. And the other is to say, let me listen and let me remember the Rebbe that didn't like me so much and what I did, right? So the question is, where is the room? And the fantasy that power is, even to assume that kibbut av v'em is a regulatory function, there's a problem with that. Why should anything be only a regulatory function? It's also regulatory because people need regulation. It's not only regulation because people need to talk to each other. And then you get to sometimes the fantasy, no, people don't need to listen to each other. Where does the Torah say that you're not allowed to listen to your son? how he talks, how you listen. Where's the idea that it's also for a father to listen to his son's pain? But if he thinks that he has to have the solution, he won't listen to the question and say, we got to think about it together. What's the matter with thinking about things together? That's how life is, right? So Nathaniel's bringing in something very important, which is a certain fantasy which all of us have in all cultures, that if the world were the way it once was, it would be so much easier, because then people know their positions. You read the ancient literature, and you see that that's not the case. Anyway, so the trauma will restrict the I positions, correct? Okay? And the triangles, trauma is a triangle. If you look at Israeli life, we're all triangulated with the Palestinians, right? We say, if it weren't for them, we would be fine. If it weren't for them, we would be safe. Huh? Crime in the street isn't connected to the missiles.
Why is
If it weren't
triangle?
because we're saying that it's about somebody else. So you and I are fine if it weren't for the fact that the missile was falling. But the missile's falling. So that's the only problem that we have. The only problem. So you regulate yourself around the enemy. All enemies are a problem that way. Right? Well, if you're living with the problem of the enemy, you're not free to talk about the conflicts between ourselves. You project them all onto the bad guy. And as a result, there's not much room for co-creation. Yehuda, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm saying this is like let's say missiles and war, that's a huge trauma, but if someone goes through day-to-day, it's pretty subjective what people consider trauma. Like someone could go and view all bad circumstances, a boss as the enemy.
Right.
And that's like a personal way of handling.
Right. If you look at the populations under trauma, you'll see that, for example, the London Blitz was, what goes on in Gaza is small potatoes basically compared to the London Blitz. Even what goes on in Gaza, let alone goes on, on our side. In the London Blitz, people were much less neurotic. People were much less neurotic. Why? Because they didn't have any time to be neurotic. In other words, all of the conflicts were projected onto the surviving. And surviving pulls people together, so that's a solution. But the question is what happens after the London Blitz? Can you talk about different ways that we were afraid? Ways that worked and ways that didn't work? Or do you say, we won, they lost, and never go back and discuss it? In Europe, after World War I, that was a huge problem. Nobody could talk about World War I. I'm not talking about the Holocaust. And for example, in English society, some of you know it much better than I, a whole generation of young men were lost. They went and they never came back. And there's a whole generation of young women who couldn't get married because there were no men. And nobody could talk about it for 50 years, until like the 70s. I met some people in actually the 80s who were just beginning to talk about World War I. And what happened. These things take a huge amount of time. So when you start to have war, you set the clock into slow motion. We all know it about our own trauma with the Holocaust, and that it takes generations to recover. It's not something that you do over one generation. One generation you don't talk at all, or you just only talk. It's all regulation. The second generation, you try to figure out what on earth was going on in the first generation. And the third generation, which may be here among us, you start to say, we need to talk about how that affects what we are now. And because what we are now needs room to be who we are now, and there's this anchor back into trauma. So if we take a family, and we're going to take, this is the Palestinian family, we're going to take our family that is under missile attack in 2004. This is a lecture I gave in 2012, so I put it back 8 years. And I brought it forward until 2020, so it's next year. But we take this family and we say, okay, well, one of the missiles fell in Sderot. Sderot in 2004, there certainly was there were no bomb shelters. And so this missile fell 100 meters from home. And the 6-year-old kid was frightened to death. Right? There was no place to run. There was a huge explosion. He experienced trauma. Trauma is when one way to say it is that the ego skills or the ego strengths are overwhelmed. Another way to say it is that you're overwhelmed with an emotional impact that you can't think about. Another way to see it is that your amygdala has exploded and it can't connect. There's no connectivity to the prefrontal cortex. Another way to say it is that it happens too fast. So when it happens, there's no way to prepare for it. There's no foresight. So you haven't prepared the path of connection to the prefrontal cortex. And, you know, every generation will have a new brain science way of looking at it. In short, you freak out. And when you freak out, you're alone. In other words, it's more than I can handle, and it's more, and I feel that I'm alone. It happens to me, just to me. And since I'm freaking out, I don't have thinking, and I don't have language, right? So, a 6-year-old child, the younger child in this family, is exposed to post-trauma. Now, what are the signs of post-trauma in children? The most common sign of post-trauma in children is that that it affects, well, all of trauma sort of winds up the soul. It's like a spring. It winds it up and you can't let it go. A wound up child can't pay attention, right? So he starts to do pretty badly in first grade. It isn't studying, it isn't able to learn. And naturally somebody thinks he has PTSD. The person who thinks he has ADHD. The person who thinks he has ADHD is the neurologist who lives on the other side of 100 meters and has post-trauma himself and can't think. So it gives him, these things happen. And so he gives him Ritalin. But Ritalin makes, what does Ritalin do to a wound-up spring? It winds it up more. So he's failed Ritalin, so he's untreatable. He now has ADHD. Nobody's called him post-trauma. He has ADHD and he doesn't respond to Ritalin, so he's, as we say in Israel, dafuk. We have a problem, he's never going to do very well. And so, how does the family get organized around this? This is, you know, the missile was the missile, but now we have the missile inside the family. How are we going to deal with this kid who's all wound up for the missile? And the family needs to regulate itself, right? And so, the 11-year-old girl, the older sister, takes on the role of, instead of going out with her friends, and she ends up coming home a lot to take care of her brother, who comes home re-traumatized at school every day by people who are screaming at him because he can't pay attention. And probably the teacher also has post-trauma, is a little wound up. So that's life. That's life these days in Ashkelon. Ashkelon, you know, in the last few, they were totally clobbered. And there are very many people who weren't near something that fell and exploded and made them very frightened. And so I'm not telling, I made this up in 2012, but in 2015 this is what actually happened. So the girl takes care of the brother, and the mother is a bit overwhelmed with this child, and so she has her 60-year-old mother become super grandma. Maybe some of you have seen families like this, where super grandma, probably connected to less than super grandpa, is very interested in becoming involved in the next generation and not so much in what's going on in the spouse system. So we have a situation that's organized as a purely human response of regulation, right? And so what would it look like? The father starts to feel like, I don't know what to do here. You know, these women are all surrounding this kid and taking care of him. So maybe I'll just make some more money and, you know, go out and be busy on my own. There's not much I can do with this child because every time I try to do something with him, because, you know, I have a little post-trauma too, so it makes me irritable. So my daughter says, no, Dad, you're not being up. So to say it, and then Mom says it, and then Grandma says it. No, you take care of it. So the family organizes itself in a regulatory function, right? What will the regulation look like? It'll look like a triangle. What will the triangle look like? So here we have 2004. The family, this is what you asked, Marsha, right? We're regulating that the daughter is a partner with the other women in the previous generations. We have good women here. We have wonderful women here. They're sacrificing, the girl is sacrificing herself. She's taking care of her brother, and between these three women, somehow the child is regulated. Nobody thinks he has post-trauma, so they keep regulating him, right? Now, this is a form. This is a triangle. Once it gets created, it works too well. It works, but it works too well. And so it'll have a certain cost. The cost will be into subjectivity, right? In other words, the differentiation in the family goes down. The girl can't say, I'm 11, you take care of her. So there's something she can't say. The mother can't say, listen to her husband, he needs a father, because the father's a bit wound up too, so he's better off a little bit more distant. Grandma's quite happy to find a new meaning in life. And so the family is a regular family. These weren't people whose differentiation was low, but differentiation become lower. And it's organized around the central triangle. Can you see that as a human experience that lowers differentiation? Something happened, the differentiation is now less than it was before. They're not bad people. And if you go and ask mom and dad how they were brought up and why they have such low differentiation, they won't know what you're talking about, right? But if you say, tell me something, in 2000 were you able to talk in a different way? Oh, then you'll start to talk in a different way. So now, if you look at this and say, well, that's where we set the clock. Now, let's go forward. See, the boy is going to grow up now without learning. So here's where you need to know everything that you learned in the first semester and more. Right? You need to know child development, because in the family clock, what happens is that development gets skewed, and so you need to know what development gets skewed. So what's the developmental task of a 6-year-old boy? This, a family therapist was talking to dad, is thinking about, the boy, got wound up. So was he able to learn? And not just was he able to learn, he got bad grades, but he managed to get through. Was he able to love learning? Huh? Was he able to enjoy his intellectual capacity? The answer is no. He kind of, stuck through school because the idea was regulation. You're not going to say how to get through, school. So now what happens to a boy who doesn't enjoy his mind? It happens to brilliant boys who get grades without having to work. What happens to a boy who doesn't enjoy his mind? He doesn't develop sublimations. Right? He doesn't develop that track that's supposed to go on between 6 and 12 when the impulses are a little less strong and you're able to start to have light in your eyes when you're learning something and say, oh, I have something that gives me pleasure. In other words, you take instinctual pleasure and move it up to the brain, right, to the intellectual capacities. That's what's called sublimations. That it actually becomes an organ of pleasure. Why do you need that? Because when the organs of pleasure get more mature in adolescence, you need to be able to have pleasure from your thinking, to be able to think as an adolescent. Otherwise, you'll just be swept away by your body. So he's not preparing himself for adolescence because he doesn't have sublimations. Okay? And the 11-year-old girl, something that I think we'll probably have to pick this up at some other point, because we didn't get to it. I don't think Barbara got to it, and I know I didn't get to it, is that 11-year-old girls, that's when they begin to say to themselves, I have a voice. I have a voice, or I don't have a voice. It doesn't matter, right? It's just what everybody else thinks, and that's a separate developmental issue, but you say, okay, so both of these are happening simultaneously. The girl is giving up her voice, the boy is not developing sublimations, and so that will keep the triangle pretty steady, because everybody needs everybody to keep it regulated. So that would be what we would call, that's the beginning. So now we move forward from 2004 to 2011, a mere 7 years. When you're around families, you need a lot of time. You need to think about long spaces of time. If you do what I do, and stay in the same place for 35 years, you'll see time. It'll convince you, because you'll see it as it develops, but you're not there yet, none of you, so you have to sort of imagine it. But 7 years is not a long period of time, but there's an objective passage which is absolutely predictable, which is that the boy is 13 and the girl is 18. Now, that's an objective passage. It happens in every family. When you started to see this child, you're a trauma expert. You go to the area around Gaza, That's what happens in Israel, unfortunately, that all the trauma experts run to Gaza when there's a war. As a result, they wipe out all the local talent that could be developing because there's more talent out in Tel Aviv. So everybody comes in, saves Gaza for about 4 months. That's not family time. And then disappear. And they forget to develop the resources within Gaza that can continue to look at these things. So if we were the family expert in 2004 in Tel Aviv, running into Gaza, we would like to say, what we need to do is to think how this family's going to get to 2011. Because when the boy is 13 and doesn't have sublimations, he's going to become a pretty difficult adolescent. But when he becomes 13, she's going to become 18. How is she going to leave home? How is she going to go to Shibud Leumi or to the army or to Ulpan or wherever she's going to go? How is she going to leave home? Who's going to take care of her brother, right? It's a central triangle that's being created. We need to think forward how we can help this triangle over how long? Over 7 years. This time. But we need to try to help this family not to have a further fall in differentiation at the next passage. You see that 13 and 18 are pretty predictable. And in the meantime, the father's 47, the mother's 42, super grandma is 67. And so we say to ourselves, how is this being regulated now? Because we haven't helped the family to get this into subjectivity. So what's going to happen now? Now we have a 13-year-old, and it so happens that 13-year-olds need their fathers, right? There's something that we barely touched on. We'll get at some other point that boys. What the adolescent boy needs from his father is wind behind his sails. You know, it's a self-object function, a dyadic self-object function that boys get from their father, which is, it's great to be you. So it's great to be you. I can look at you and say, that's terrific, right? And that's what's called the ego ideal. That's not the father's function is no. The father's function is no, is the edible function. Get away from your mother, right? So the father's function of no is in a triangle. It's because he tells you to stay away from mom. The Freudian way of thinking of it. But when you're 13, you stay away from mom anyway because, that would be a little dangerous. So you become available to a dyadic relationship with your father who says it's great to be you. That's something that Peter Bloch discovered with his own son, Peter Bloch Jr., who also became a child psychoanalyst, and it's a very important point. But look here, the father's we haven't helped the father for 7 years to come closer to his son. The women have surrounded him and regulated him. And so the father's not available. It never would occur to him at the age of 47, now I'm going to start to be a dad. How am I going to do that, right? And the women are busy taking care of it. So we're going to have another developmental passage. It's also objective. It's subjective. But you see, the meaning of it is also subjective. The meaning is what's going on in this case with the 18-year-old girl who can't leave home. Because the three of us together, these ladies, we're taking care of this 13-year-old who's about to become really impossible. Up until now, he's just a little impossible. He's big now, so he's big time impossible. So we have, in 7 years, we have this triangle becoming more regulatory. Is it working? Yes. Does it have a developmental cost? Oh. Is developmental cost necessary? That's what therapy is for. To decrease developmental costs, to see where it's going and try to change it to where it might go. And now, there's another passage that's going to happen in 3 years, in 2014. What's going to happen in 2014? Well, 21 and 16, that's not so objective. What happens is that super grandma is 70 and she's no longer well. I didn't think about this when I was writing this, I wasn't this close to 70 as I am now, but that's how it goes. So now, grandma has a stroke. Not a terrible stroke, but a stroke. Now, is that an objective passage? Is that an objective passage in a nuclear family? No. Because there are nuclear families where grandma has a stroke and the family continues along. But in this family, where grandma has been the linchpin of this essential triangle, grandma's stroke, remember we made up the story about Caroline? Gabriel wants to take her on a cruise, and she's so over-involved. Huh? So here, the fact that grandma has a stroke is a pragmatic passage. It happens here and now. It's objective, but it hasn't happened in all families. It happens in this family because somebody who's not in the nuclear family has a nuclear family function. That's the definition of a pragmatic passage. Somebody who's not in the nuclear family has a nuclear family function. And then when that person has a change, it's like a nuclear family change. But it's not the case in all families. You need to understand this family. And so, you know, when this girl tells her best friend about her mother, her grandma having a stroke, and her best friend says, so? Okay, you know, so? And no, you don't understand. The whole world has changed. How is the whole world changed? For her, the whole world has changed. The central triangle is not going to work anymore. So that would be a pragmatic message. You understand the difference? It's, if grandma were mom, if mom had a stroke, that would be an objective passage. Because it's grandma and not every grandma is in this particular function. So we call it a pragmatic passage. It's a non-universal objective passage. Okay? So now, what's going to happen to the family? Let's see how is it going to regulate? And the answer is that this girl at 21 finds herself needing to do something different. So she gets pregnant. And this is I want you to put so you have to see this because it's a very important contribution. This is what, this isn't a picture of you, Peggy, but this is what pregnancy looks like in a genogram. That's my only real contribution to family therapy. That's how to draw pregnancy in a family. Now we go back to me because another. And so we're going to have a completely different family, right? Because the older daughter is now functioning in a different way, and she's being drawn to a different situation. Now we're going to move from 2014 to 2000. You see how the older daughter's pregnancy might be an answer to the pragmatic passage. You know that the central triangle is fallen apart. We need to find some other way to define myself. So instead of taking care of my brother, I'm going to take care of her baby. So that doesn't change my function too much, but it also gives my mom something to do with me and the baby. And then in 2000, we said 2014, the baby is born. It's a way of dealing with a pragmatic passage without intersubjectivity. Well, here we are in 2020, and this girl of 27 has a 6-year-old boy, right? A 6-year-old boy. When did it all start? With a 6-year-old boy, right? It started with her taking care of a 6-year-old boy and not being able to grow herself. And so when she has a 6-year-old boy, that's a purely subjective passage, right? That has a meaning connected to the generation before. It doesn't have objective meaning. 6 has objective meaning. 6 you go to school. But in this case, it has an added subjective passage. And so when we find that the daughter is having marital conflict with her husband, who says, I don't understand, we would be doing fine. The kid turns 6, goes to school, and you are going completely nuts. Not only are you going nuts, but you're acting like you don't have a husband and like he doesn't have a father. Where does this come from? Right? We're in 2020. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from 2004, which is not so long ago, if you understand families. And so you would ask the daughter something about, now, what is going on with this 23-year-old with PTSD? He went to the army, he didn't go to the army, or there's something else that's going on with him. If she comes to PY with her 6-year-old boy and says he didn't seem to have attention deficit until now, but suddenly he's just so wound up that he can't be managed. And you say, well, let's do a developmental, blah, blah, blah. And you look at the kid. But if you're a family therapist, you say, oh, let's look at this, and let's look at this, and let's see if how you deal with a 6-year-old child isn't an opportunity for intersubjective change. Is this the time that we've been waiting for a mere 16 years? And is this the time where through this boy, we're going to help you to understand how that affected your life with your mother and your grandmother, how it affects your relationship with your husband, and how now, 16 years after the trauma, we're going to be able to talk about it. And maybe it takes 16 years to get there, right? In other words, we could say, well, everybody's, been off the wall and should have been in therapy when, 15 years ago. Or you could say, this is the time it takes. When you're a therapist, that's the only useful statement you can make. You can't change the past. You could wish you could, but it's a waste of time. But you can say from here, this is the opportunity. Now we're further away from the trauma. And you might want to bring in your brother and talk with him about, your role with him and how he's doing and so forth. That's a subjective passage that happens in the next generation. So hopefully this gives you a sense of family time, of how you set your clock. A 6-year-old comes in for treatment in 2020, right? And you set your clock and you say, okay, how have we been getting here? And is this an opportunity to do something that hasn't happened before? So that's where you would hopefully get to the point of what are called new meanings. New meanings are intersubjective. And sometimes when you're dealing with trauma, it takes a generation to get to the point of intersubjectivity. So that's what we try to do. We try to, with the trauma lowers the differentiation, brings it more to regulation. We try to find a way to take the low differentiation and move it longer. It takes time. And sometimes you don't have much control over it. So now, yeah.
I'm assuming that trauma refers to anything that is a serious disruption in what's going on in the family, like a parent getting sick.
Wait, I couldn't hear you. What?
So I'm assuming that trauma
Right.
is going to refer to anything that's a serious disruption in the function of the family,
It may.
even a parent getting sick or something like that.
Right, it may. It doesn't have to. See, I skipped over this, but there are families, some of you may come from families like that experience trauma and go beyond it. In other words, they create something of higher differentiation with it. There are a small number of families that can do that. Many of them are represented here, which makes therapists dangerous. Because you say to yourself, we did it, why can't they? That's really dangerous, right? Because it's a small number of people who can actually spontaneously move from regulation to intersubjectivity, and the great majority of people will need help with it. And if they didn't need help with it, then you wait for the next opportunity. But you don't want to take what you can learn from your own family or from your neighbor that did so well is what's missing in this family. But what you want to do in therapy is to take what might have been and make it happen together with you. Yeah.
So you're saying that there are people that come from families that can deal with very well with trauma that become therapists?
Well, here we have, in this room here, a bunch of most would say, who are we? People with families that are high differentiation or low differentiation or moving differentiation? And the answer is, we're a bunch of people.
That wasn't exactly my question, but okay.
Yeah, what was your question exactly? Do therapists come from high differentiation families?
What?
No. Therapists come from families where the therapist had a particular role and enough, ability to process pain and thinking to be able to say it could have been different. That's what makes a therapist. I think some of us at least.
Now, is there something specific that makes it easier, let's say, that for this girl that now has a child, to actually deal with it? Means it's obviously showing up now, but
yes.
What about the time now is different?
What would make it easier for her?
Yeah.
Everything that makes life easier. In other words, if she has a husband who is in a good financial situation, so they don't have to worry about, the bottom line every month. If they have a family that, around them or a community around them that's supportive, if she has good friends, all of those things are what makes movement from regulation to differentiation more possible. And so there's no real distinction between doing community therapy and doing family therapy, because when the community embraces the family and helps them to deal with their pain, the family does better.
But there's nothing inherently there's nothing inherently more chance of the girl dealing with her issues that happened when her brother was 6, now that her son is 6. It just could be that the circumstances are different that will allow her to do it.
Possibly, and everything that's happened to her growing up. Let's say when she was 16 and said, my friends are out, having fun. I'm home with my brother and my mom and my grandmother. I wonder why, but I wish it were different. That would help her, 10 years later. If she was saying to herself, this is who I am, this makes me a good girl, and I want to be this way for the rest of my life, it's going to be harder for her to change. So those are some of the factors, but the word inherent is a little bit too strong for what we know. It might be there, but we don't know it. So what we try to do in our vocabulary is use words that are descriptive of what we can use. And when you start to use words that are stronger than what we really have a hold on, like inherent, you end up shooting yourself in the foot. Because then you say to yourself things that are like, there's nothing to do about it because it's X. There's a lot of X's like that. But we want to keep our vocabulary at a certain level. One last question, and then we have to talk about our own family. Yeah?
So similar question, so the families who get stuck in regulation versus the families who move on, is it also similar factors, ego strengths, finances,
Yeah.
qualities?
Right. There are a million different factors, and therapists look for the things that move things ahead. In other words, the therapist doesn't necessarily say, look, Mom, if you go into psychoanalysis, then by the time your kid is 13, you'll understand what you did wrong, because he'll already be 13, right? So that's one way of doing it. But, you think about everything that makes life, see, a well-supported life in terms of things that don't distract you for just survival, allow you to go towards intersubjectivity. Do they make it necessarily that you? Not necessarily. And how many factors are there that are involved? Too many to name, right? In other words, we're dealing, if you think about what are the factors, so start to make the list, you'll never finish, right? So what you want to do with families as therapists is not to make the whole list of all of them. You want to find out what can we change now. Which of the factors is impactful now, that if we change it, for example, if we say in 2020 to this girl's husband, something happened to her 16 years ago, that if the way you understand it, it would help you to understand that what she's doing with you isn't about you, it's about her. And that will make you a better spouse. And he says, oh, that would be very helpful for me. So then we found one factor that's very important, which is that she now has a husband who understands her. That'll make a huge difference, right? We say, well, your mother, your grandmother, that could happen later. Now, this is where we can turn off the tape. Because